This is a video that's meant to summarize this particular section that I called Cosmonomy, or the Universal Laws of Physics. It's video 1 to 9. I just intend here to just give you a quick resume so you don't waste your time looking at things you're not interested. And it's basically, these 9 videos are trying to give you evidence about this claim that quantum physics, in my opinion, is a cult, not a science. These are accusation videos, and I just want to justify it so I don't alienate you already, because you might be used to the fluffy stuff where we care more about how we say something rather than what we say. But my point is this: if I give you my reasons, then I accuse no one but myself. So if I happen to be a bonehead with no brains, you'll see it very quickly within the next few seconds, and you don't have to go on looking at the rest of the video or any of the other ones. This is not clickbait. I'm just trying to explain something that I think is very important, because this cult has grown so far that nobody dares question them, because their own Nobel Prize winners and no other science discipline dares to question this nonsense, although in their own field they would never accept such nonsense. What I owe you is a clear statement of the accusation and a clear logical path for the algorithm being accused and what I propose. So if I do that, then it's up to you. You can judge it clearly, without modesty, without political correctness, without respect for our elders and so on, which are all lies anyway. The greatest sin against science and natural philosophy, in my view, is this guy and the people like him. His statement that imagination is more important than knowledge is frankly idiotic for a scientist. If you're a poet, if you are an artist, then maybe. But for a scientist, imagination is the great enemy of reality. It is not your job to imagine things. It is your job to observe reality and observe nature and then explain it, if you can, which is what Newton did, which is what Socrates did. And that's a natural philosopher. This is a mathematician. This is what I would call intellectual masturbation, in making yourself feel good and making yourself feel important. And the other thing is that primitive human mathematics, I mean, if you look at some of these videos, they actually claim that somehow we have discovered in some hole or in some cave the perfect tool that was left there by gods or someone, where we can find perfect truth from using mathematical equations. They seem to miss the point that we've invented this thing. This is monkey mathematics, and it's there to help us in some ways, which is, I agree, it's necessary for us, for our survival, but it's still monkey mathematics. It is not a fire to our intellectual Prometheus. It's not a gift from God. We have invented this thing. So primitive human mathematics does not count as evidence. So just because an equation gives you a result and the result is stupid, you should question your method and your result rather than accuse the universe of being weird. So all the ensuing quantum mythology has grown out of these two errors, and everybody else seems to think that imagination, and if you go into some of the quantum nonsense that you see, it makes the Bible look positively more scientific. The amount of nonsense they go on about the black holes and the wormholes and infinite universes, and it's just unbelievable, especially when, as you can see as we go along, the most basics of physics they don't even understand, and that's what is quite amazing, why you would make these jumps. So quantum is a cult, not a science. What is the essence of a cult? How do we recognize a cult? A cult says to you, do not trust your own sense of reason, so it's beyond reason, accept irrational explanations, ignore obvious evidence or evidence against something, prefer magic and mystery, which by the way makes you then an intellectual elite, and you feel superior to everybody else because you can understand things that mere mortals can't understand, and that has got to have a great intellectual currency. Do not trust anyone but us. We are the experts and your only friends. So that's the other thing. And give us your money and we will enlighten you, which is what all the institutions have become anyway. They're not about education, they're about making money. So look at our display cabinet of Nobel Prizes. We must be right, because every time you open the quantum toilet, they throw a Nobel Prize at you. And of course, that in some ways must mean that these guys are geniuses and they are special and everybody else is stupid. And that's what causes the problem that nobody wants to ask questions about, because you feel stupid. So videos 1 to 9 will try to justify these, what might seem to you very arrogant claims. Like I said before, if I give you my reasons, then I accuse no one but myself. So anyway, video 1 deals with the most basic of all things, which I think is vital that you see first. What are atoms really? If you think, let's forget about quarks and subatomic nonsense, we'll come to that later, but let's take the most visible event in the universe which no physicist will argue against, which is the atomic speciation. It all begins with the fusion of hydrogen atom. One electron orbiting one proton, and everything else then grows from this through fusion. So if you have here, for example, helium, 4 protons, by the way, neutrons are manufactured by this, they're not a distinct particle in the universe. I'll explain a little bit more later. They are just a proton, a modified proton. In fact, they may not even be modified, because that to me seemed more like a covalent bonding of 4 protons using some of the electrons that were in the orbit through fusion, rather than having a distinct 2 different things, because why would the electron prefer one proton to another? But my point here is they're just protons, and the electron's still around it. If you go to oxygen, for example, more protons here, again, neutrons, remember, are protons, just modified, even if they are, and all electrons around the top, and if you go to sodium, more protons there, more electrons out there. It is exactly the same pattern that just repeats itself in a fractal way. So in essence, you're perfectly within reason to believe that that's just a bigger hydrogen atom. Why not? It's more or less exactly the same. The fact that the different species of atom, that's a separate equation, but my point here is that in terms of the physics only, you're basically looking at a bigger and bigger thing. A rock is made up of all of these things, different elements. So therefore, a rock is just the same thing. Lots of protons, lots of electrons. The moon is made up of rocks, the same thing exactly. So it's just a bigger lump of protons and electrons. The sun, exactly the same, but much bigger, much more population of protons and electrons and so on. And the black hole at the center of the galaxy, even more so. So what is my point? My point is this, that you have the electron slope food chain. This food chain is identical to the food chain in the Serengeti, because electron slope is what defines the food. Your food is electron rich compared to you. That is what you want from food. All animals do exactly the same, and all of the objects and all of the things like you see here operate on exactly the same thing, because the universe is very basic. It just repeats the same pattern over and over again. So the hydrogen here, there's a proton, there's an electron, and here we have a lump of protons and electrons, but this is a bigger one. So relative to the rock, this becomes now the proton, and the rock becomes its electron, and that's why it enters it into an orbit, if it ever comes into it, just like there. That's why the Earth and the moon orbit around the sun, because the population of protons is much bigger here, and that then becomes relative to this, the proton, and they become the electron. And then in terms of the black hole in the center of the galaxy, the sun is electron rich, that is proton rich, and then you have exactly the same. So smaller fish is the prey item for this fish, but this fish is prey item to that fish. So relative to this one, this is a predator relative to that one, and so on and so forth. So it's a basic, simple process. So that was about what the atoms are in essence. Video 2, charge theory, is completely wrong. This is some idiotic stuff that has been left with electricity days and the magnetic days, because remember, the modern physics owes its origins to electricity and magnetism. And so the nomenclature that were used and the mistakes that were made have been carried through blindly. Because if you look at a magnet, first of all, north, south, positive, negative really means nothing if you don't understand the motion waves, or if you like, the electromagnetic waves. But in any case, even if you do subscribe positive and negative ends to it, then yes, the positive bit does come from the proton and the negative bit does come from the electron. But the assumption then that positives repel one another and negatives repel one another and the opposites are actually attractive is completely wrong. It is completely wrong, because if you look at it here, if you have 2 north poles, or the motion rich ends where it comes out, it's like if you think about a magnet, think of it like a vacuum cleaner. It blows air at this end and it sucks it at the other end. So when you put the 2 north poles, look at what happens to the direction of the electron waves. They push one another apart. If you were to turn it around, that direction would coincide with that one, and they would be attractive. But now look at, this is the important part. That's an obvious statement, but look at the positive bits where this nonsense comes along, that the positives will repel one another. And by the way, here, the negatives only repel one another if the direction of the motion is not right, because when the directions are the same, they actually attract one another. So the idea that electrons are negative and they always repel one another is nonsense. It's not true. They only repel one another if the direction of the motion is opposing, like two cars smashing into one another. So when you put the negatives again, if you look at it, there's the vector of forces of the motion wave, and here's the vector wave. So obviously they push against one another and they repel one another. In what way is the proton or the positive end responsible for this behavior? Well, it isn't. It's still the same motion wave that opposes one another. So the proton is being blamed for being repulsive to itself without understanding this concept. So the opposites attract law is a complete madness. It's not true at all. The insane claim is this, that in the hydrogen atom, the electron is negatively charged and the proton is positively charged, and they are mutually attracted to one another, and the charge is balanced. Everything about this statement is completely wrong. Everything about it is wrong. To start with, why, if the electron and the proton are mutually attractive, the proton remains in an orbit and doesn't fall into it? Even a complete moron should be able to understand this. Yes, they bodge this up through infinite energy levels and so on, which doesn't make any sense at all. Look at the obvious statement here. Think of the electron as a bird, and you holding it with a rope or a piece of string. This bird doesn't want to be anywhere near you. It wants to run away from you. Two things, if you assume two fundamental self-evident truths. One, this bird wants to be as far away from you as possible, and at the same time retain maximum freedom. What is going to happen? Maximum freedom is in an orbit, so it's still going round, it's still actually flying, and the maximum distance is defined by the length of that strength and the energy of that bird. If the bird was bigger, i.e. excited states, the electron jumps out, goes further out, loses energy, comes back down. It always trying to get away from this thing. It is not mutually attracted to it at all. So this is a bodge up again in physics that shouldn't exist there, and it'll become much more easier for you to see later, because the idea that the electron must lose infinite amounts of energy before it can fall into the proton is nonsense anyway, because how else would you get neutrons? And you don't see infinite amount of energy. So neutron formation means the electron does fall into the nucleus under extreme gravitational lattice pressure, but they don't even know what gravity is. So you'll see that in a minute. So my point is this, that if the positive were repulsive to one another and the electrons also repel one another, you would never get bonding. That would be impossible, because this is a preferred state of the hydrogen atom. Two protons, two electrons. It wants to be in this state rather than in this state. What brain in this world would accept that this is as a result of two negative events? In other words, two repulsions, because the electrons should repel one another, they should want to be nowhere near one another, and also the protons don't want to be near one another. In fact, this is the preferred state, which means electrons do not repel one another. They only repel one another if their direction is opposing, and protons do not repel one another. This happens because, for two reasons. One, the protons grab more electrons, and they feel as if they have more, which they don't, because the ratios don't change. But the electrons have a bigger space now to be traveling in, so their degrees of freedom have increased instead of this one. Remember, degree of freedom and as far away as possible. The main point of this is that, and then of course we get from this to what gravity is, because the ratios have not changed, so why should it stop? So if you have a nebula of hydrogen, it will just keep condensing, because the ratios never change. So electrons and protons do not repel their kind. That is total nonsense. The charge theory is completely wrong, because number one, you wouldn't get bonding. That would be impossible, because the electrons should be pushing each other apart. There would be no bonding in any compounds, because the electronic cloud is most furthest away, and they would repel one another. The proton would also repel one another, and this would not be the preferred state. I repeat, they don't want to be here as hydrogen atoms. They want to be here. Why? Because, well, I just explained it. And also, if protons were repelling repulsive to one another, you would not get nuclei growth. That would not be possible. Protons, by it seems, have no affinity for one another, but they do grow. In other words, the gravity of this event here, one proton, is much smaller than the gravity of this event, because now this thing is proportionately grown, if you know what I mean. The protons add. This is how gravity grows. So like charges are additive, not repulsive. They actually add one to one another. Electrons show interference patterns. Think about this for a moment, please. How could they show interference pattern? Interference pattern, if you were a physicist and you wanted to describe love, then you could not find a better word than interference patterns. They actually combine and become one. And how could that be if something is, repulsive? The answer, it isn't. It's only repulsive if the direction is opposing. Electrons combine and increase in intensity. Again, how could that be possible if they were repulsive? Charge theory is nonsense. Bonding would not be possible if electrons repelled one another, as I just showed you. Protons are positive, they do not repel one another, or there would be no nuclei growth. So again, this thing is completely wrong. It's been taken from a bad interpretation of magnetism and extended into atoms, which then throws everything a million miles away. And then all the other mistakes after that compounded, because you want to keep now bodging things up. Instead of looking at this and cleaning house, you just keep going and you keep bodging things up. So protons are additive because gravity grows with mass. Video 3 is entirely about gravity and where gravity comes from, and in my view, this is what gravity is. This is the house of physics, and gravity is this gigantic bloody elephant that's just standing there and nobody can see it because they're busy with their eyes closed looking at equations. Gravity should be obvious, and I have no idea how it could have been missed. Gravity and bonding are the same. Basically, all atoms and molecules relative to one another, like I showed you before, are either a proton cluster or an electron cluster, depending on the population size, exactly the same way as the Earth is an electron to the sun's proton. The same thing, it just grows. As the population of protons in a given event or a cluster grows, that its gravity grows. So the relative reactions that take place between atoms is identical to everything else, which is what you should expect it to be, because everything is made up of these things. So have a look at that, and it gives you a lot more of an explanation as to, if you're interested in the thing. But here's a very brief summary of that video. So hydrogen preferentially goes and becomes a hydrogen molecule. Since nothing has changed in the ratios, why would it stop? So it keeps attracting more and more hydrogen. But look at the fundamental thing, what happens in space. If two trapeze artists dangling from ropes grabbed each other and pulled, what would happen? There's the force vector of both. They get squashed. This is where the squashing effect of gravity comes in. Now you keep adding more and more and more. It doesn't matter how many ad infinitum, all of the force vectors would be towards this center. That's where you get the squashing force of gravity, because the force of all of the vectors will be directed to the middle, and it gets bigger in the middle, and it decreases as it goes out, which is what gravity is. So fundamentally, like I said, they're all relative, and it starts off from this relationship of a proton in the middle, electrons in the orbit, and it never changes, because why would it? Everything is made up of the same thing, and it just increases in a fractal way. So here's another one that we're going to this, now getting to the particle zoo business. Physicists seem to love particles. They can't do without it, because the monkey mathematics apparently demands it. But more importantly, the more particles you look for, the ghosts, and then you find them, the more prizes you win. And like I said, they're throwing at them Nobel Prizes like they were confetti. So videos 4, 5, and 6 will explain to you non-existent ghosts. They do not exist. None of them exist, because everything, as you've just shown you, begins with a hydrogen atom, an electron, and a proton. Now here's the first one, so that we begin, and this should make sense to you. What they're saying is that the universe is a spider. The common understanding of all the physicists is that the universe is a spider. It has 8 legs. It has nuclear strong, nuclear weak, electromagnetism, and gravity are the 4 forces, which they call fundamental forces, and the particles are proton, electron, neutron, and photon. There's 4 there and 4 there. So essentially they're saying that these are the fundamental forces without which the universe cannot be explained. You have to have all this. I'm saying to you nonsense. You can explain it with just two, which I've already tried to do before, but I will get into a bit more deeper. Now, here's the point. If I am wrong, my explanation should seem to you like an abomination. It should seem like an a complete abortion. It should be immediately obvious to you that I'm an idiot. So it should make no sense. It should be tragic as an explanation. But let's have a look. It all begins with just two. If you accept fusion and atomic speciation, then hydrogen is the start, without a doubt. You can't have it both ways. If you accept that all atoms grow out of the fusion of hydrogen atoms, then hydrogen is the start. Now watch this, what happens. When hydrogen combines under gravitation, like I said to you, it preferentially wants to be the hydrogen molecule, but then ratios don't change, keep adding more. Eventually, as the mass becomes critical, fusion ignites, because the center at the center, all of the force vectors, which I just explained for gravity, becomes critical, because all of the force vectors, as you know, keep pushing into the nucleus. And out of the fusion, look what happened. First, we get a neutron, and we get photons are manufactured by this process. So why would you call a photon or a neutron a fundamental particle? They're not. They're manufactured. So they have nothing to do with one another. So why are we double counting things with blind equations? More importantly, since the photon has come from the electron somehow, okay, we'll leave the electronic mass alone for a minute, because that's another idiotic concept that nobody seems to have thought about, is that because it's manufactured from there, they must be very, very closely related. And protons are neutrons, if you like, which are covalently probably bonded here for protons, using some of the electrons that were there. More important, look what else has happened. We've also manufactured here the nuclear strong and the nuclear weak forces. There was no nucleus before, now it is, and the force itself has been manufactured by this relationship here. So where did that come from? What is a nuclear strong and nuclear weak force if it is not the affinity of the electron to the affinity of the proton to the electron as it captures it, because the electron doesn't want to be there. I just explained it to you. It wants to run away. So essentially, the particle is full of non-existent ghosts. I've just shown you that you don't need 8. You've just manufactured most of those. You're double counting. You're looking at a man and a shadow and counting 2 of them, when in fact they're just the same thing. So videos 4, 5, and 6 will show you that unfortunately people don't get. I mean, what I'm saying to you is obvious, and nobody would get a Nobel Prize for saying the obvious. But if you make it that every time you open the quantum toilet and a new particle jumps out, then I'm afraid, yes, you must be a genius and you must be special. So what is this Hadron Collider? If you really think about it, from what I just said to you, if everything is just a hydrogen atom, what would you expect is going to happen? All you're going to do is you're going to put more and more energy into the system. And what is energy? Electromagnetic waves that come from the magnets, and they are just more electrons, essentially, because that's what the electron is. So you're basically taking a black and white vase and you're smashing it against lead nuclei or lead walls, and what do you expect to get? A particle zoo, of course, all fragments of the same crap that are going everywhere, and you've actually think that you've discovered new particles. But more importantly, whatever instrument you use at that level is going to corrupt this experiment anyway, because at the subatomic levels, everything interacts with one another. And you will see that in the 2-hole experiment, because it is a total shambles. It is a corrupted experiment, because you cannot be objective at that level. Everything interacts with one another at the atomic level. So Dirac and antimatter. Here's another ghost that they first of all predicted. Dirac's blind acceptance of negative energy levels predicted the positron. Why you would do that? If you use this equation and you came up with negative numbers of cows in your field, you would dismiss it. And most people do dismiss it when they get plus or minus, but not Dirac. He assumed that there would be positrons, and lo and behold, you look for ghosts and you find ghosts. And they found them in this deposit were found in a cloud chamber experiment. And basically what that is they're not really understanding what a negative pole is within a magnet. A negative pole is very electron rich. So once you've created a very positively charged or an electron poor event within the gas clouds, the electron-rich end will lose an electron. So in other words, all you're doing is you're looking at an electron going the other way around. First of all, for example, you hit something, you smash it into something, and lo and behold, you release an electron. And that electron is absorbed by the positive end, like a bolt of lightning, using all of the gas atoms and molecules as a bridge. But having created this negative one, now, the positive charge or the electron-hungry event, it's going to try and steal an electron from the neighboring atom, which is then going to try and steal from the other one. But lo and behold, since you actually got a lot of electrons here at the negative end of the magnetic pole, you basically, all you're doing is you're balancing the charges. The positive end of the magnet has absorbed an electron, the negative one loses one, and everything becomes back into normal. So the cloud chamber events is a nonsense. There are no such things as positrons. Basically, the positron is the electron going the other way around. Here's another one. Video 7 will deal with the two-hole experiment, which in my view, and I can try and show you, who knows, you might hopefully agree, is the most stupid experiment in science. If this was done in any other scientific discipline, the people who did it and the interpretation of the results would be laughed at, but not, it seems, where quantum and physics are concerned, because like you said, people get very intimidated in arguing with people with Nobel Prizes. What it essentially means is the electrons are conscious things. They actually know we're looking at them. So the idea is this: if I turn a tap on and the water comes out, the interpretation is that the water knows I'm thirsty. More or less, that's what it means. Or if I kick a dog and the dog runs away, then it must be clairvoyant. The point I'm making is that what we have done it, whatever this experiment is done, then we have corrupted that experiment. If you place something very close to the hole to try and see which hole the event is going to, it is idiotic to believe that you can sense where the electron or the photon is going to go through without affecting the photon. That is impossible. You have just corrected it. I shouldn't have to explain this, because if you take away whatever it is behind these two holes, you get the interference pattern. As soon as you put it, it becomes, if you like, it behaves like a particle. It goes either through one or to the other. So let's just assume it doesn't know. Let's assume it's a dumb photon. What's the next explanation that fits the bill? Well, the answer is you've just introduced a field, a fluctuating field that is either attractive or repulsive in one or both of these holes. So at any given time, the photon is taking the line of least resistance and going through it. So if it comes through this, and at that point this is a repulsive force here, it will take the other one. And if it comes again and this is an attractive force, the line of least resistance is that one now, and it goes back through there. But whatever it is, you have just done it. The electron doesn't know, in the same way that water doesn't know you're thirsty when you turn the thing on. It's madness. So here's the thing. The assumption that both Schrodinger and all the rest of them made is that he keeps going on thinking that they must be both. It must be both a wave and it must be both a particle. Now, just take a moment and think about this. If you have a particle, say like a bullet, can it behave like a wave? Well, the answer is no. But can a wave behave like both? In other words, it isn't both. It's just a wave, but can it behave like both? Well, the answer is yes. Because if you have a droplet of water in the middle of winter at the back of your neck, it feels like a bullet. A little droplet of water, relatively speaking, feels like a bullet, and it creates the same thing, creates these giant waves. So the most logical thing out of these experiments is that this is what a photon or an electron is. It's just a cloud thing. It's not a particle. It's like a fluffy cloud, if you see what I mean. One of the most important things about this, it seems that you have to make the assumption, is that it will always take the path of least resistance. If you accept that, then you have what? Here it is. It behaves like a bullet. A cloud will, like a smoke cloud, if you like, it doesn't really matter, will behave like a bullet. It will go through a hole. If that hole is the line of least resistance for it, or if it is the only one available for it, it will do that. But on the other hand, how do we account for this? In fact, Schrodinger actually calculated this mathematically, which I didn't understand at the time. I must confess, when I was at uni, I actually asked this question, what is psi? And I was told it was the wave function. And I asked again, what is a wave function? I was told it was psi. And I was embarrassed to keep going, because to me it made no sense. And when I looked at everybody else, they seemed to be quite comfortable with it. But I think now, thinking back, they probably were just as confused as I am, as was the lecturer, because I don't think he understood it either. But I do understand it now, because the Schrodinger's equation basically means that the probability of finding an electron at a distant x from the nucleus at any given time is equal. Now, think for a moment what that means. If the probability of finding the electron at any given time around the surface of the Earth, compared to there's a nucleus there of the hydrogen, is equal, then it must be everywhere. That's the only conclusion that fits, because anything else doesn't fit. If it is everywhere, what is it then? It can only be a cloud. It just goes all the way around. Look at this blue thing here. And imagine that is what the electron is. It just envelops the whole thing. It's everywhere. That is the only way that equation fits. And the equation is right. It is. It can go through a hole, or it can envelop the whole thing. But it is not a particle at all. So the idea of the Schrodinger's cat and the particles collapsing is a nonsense, because it collapses at any time where the line of least resistance is offered to it. In other words, if it's here, it will go there. If it's there, it will go there. Whatever that is. The point is that it is not conscious. It is only interacting when it is in the vicinity of a thing that it can interact with. I go back to the other part. Again, the first slide I showed you, that imagination is more important than knowledge, and primitive maths counts as evidence, which is nonsense. And look at him making his own mistakes that he didn't see, because this is what sets him apart from Newton. Newton is a real natural philosopher. He observes reality first, then he explains it. This guy and his cultist followers don't care about reality. In fact, it's a bit unfair. He is my hero, by the way. Don't think I'm being disrespectful. But remember what I said. We're talking here about the truth, so we don't really care about our elders. My point is that, though, I give him he did insist that God didn't play dice, but still, look at the mistakes he's made himself. Space and time do not exist. Now, you cannot do physics if you do not accept that space and time exist, because all your equations dry up and you might as well throw it away. Acceleration, velocity, distance, work, everything falls apart if you do not believe that space and time exist. We make space and time because it is important for us, of our survivability, but we mustn't assume that it's real, because we take actual constants and we then calculate relativities, but we mustn't believe that the concept itself is real, because then it makes everything, it throws it away. So let's look at the first one, the idea of space itself. The most simple one is that if you're on the Earth and you look at the sun, you would think that there's space between you and the sun, yeah? But that's not true, because you're actually, if the sun is here, for example, which is what we said, and let's say Pluto is there, which is 40 times further out. Here's Pluto, here's the Earth. Then the Earth must be here somewhere. Now, you don't say there is space, because it's a force field and it grows bigger. That force field grown because of the population of protons that it has, and therefore there is no space anywhere, because all of these other things that you perceive, the human mind perceives as space, are just gravity. So the gravity of the black star at the center of the galaxy extends way, way beyond all of the galaxy objects itself to other galaxies, because they affect one another. So the idea that there is space is entirely a man-made mistake. There is no space. Space is gravity, because look at it. How else does Pluto revolve around the sun if it wasn't for this relationship here? Magic is better than obvious. Here's the thing. He used the relativity equations that came up with the idea of time dilation. Again, the most crazy interpretation seems to be the one everybody prefers rather than the obvious one. What Einstein doesn't understand is what is periodicity. He doesn't understand it, because if he did, nobody would have interpreted time as being relative. What is periodicity? Every atom has a rotational and vibrational frequency at a given energy level and a certain pressure and temperature. Now, those changed with acceleration. By acceleration, we of course need another definition, by the way. I think it's going to be important that we define it. Sorry, I'll define it later, because it should be injection of motion into a system, or injection of energy, rather than the change of speed, which is the only definition so far. But if you put anything, like if you warm something up, you change its periodicity. So assuming that this the mistake was made, they tested it. They put a clock, an atomic clock, in a jet high-powered jet, and they sent it out in space. And lo and behold, when it came back, the clock was slower than the clock in the lab. So they assumed, yeah, Einstein's right. Of course, time slows down. Nobody's asking this, the obvious question, for Christ's sake. Something happened to the clock. Something happened to the atoms in the clock, not time. The time that we take as a concept is the rotation of the Earth around itself and around the sun. That has nothing to do with this clock. Or even the abstract concept of a river running through the events as everything propagates is also madness. Time, as he has calculated, is periodicity, and periodicity will slow down, and the idea of why it slows down is because of the energy levels drop. When you have a vibrational frequency and you pull it again, they don't understand how acceleration happens. So if you're interested in a more, if otherwise I'm going to be explaining everything here as well, have a look please, and you'll see for yourself that there is a much more straightforward explanation for time dilation, which is a dilation of periodicity rather than time. So here's the thing, if you put that atomic clock in an oven or in a fridge, exactly the same results will happen, but that doesn't make them a time machine, does it? So why would you accept that the time changes in a jet when you wouldn't accept it here? The idea is periodicities change under acceleration. So excuse me. The other thing that Einstein makes a mistake about is the idea of mass, because he makes the intuitive mistake of thinking that mass is like a lump of coal, which is probably you do the same. You thinking mass is this thing, number of protons. Forget electrons because they don't have a mass. That's an induced mass, but we'll come to that in a minute. If you think about it for now and just accept it that most of the mass comes from the protons, remember neutrons are just modified protons, then therefore he believes that some of that is converted, i.e. the little m here, the change in mass, into energy, so therefore mass decreases a little bit and a lot of energy is released, just like burning a piece of coal. But that doesn't fit the observation. In fact, it's completely wrong. Mass does not decrease. If he had done what Newton did, first looked at the skies and thought about it before, that's not what he would have concluded. So if you think about this, all of these events here that you're seeing originally was a nebula. The nebula condensed itself in different points and it became these planets and the star here and the moons that are there. This star condensed and used all of the material, the protons if you like, from the nebula billions of years ago. And then it became a critical mass and it started to undergo fusion. But what keeps the sun going? Why does the sun keep going and it does not stop? Why did it keep going for billions of years and it keeps squashing? Because it cannot. The idea of the engine, it should have stopped at some point because there is no new material going into the sun. So it should have just stopped itself. Why does it keep going? And the idea is, of course, that there is an imbalance. Remember what I said about gravity before? Please have a look at the relative videos, because mass is not the number of protons, it is the ratio. Mass or resistance to acceleration is a ratio, is the ratio with any event of between the number of electrons or the energy that it contains and the number of protons. If you change that balance, then you change the gravitational force. In this particular case, look at what's happened for billions of years. We keep losing the thing that accelerates. If mass is resistance, which is the most amazing insight by Isaac Newton, that I don't think Einstein understood. If mass is resistance to acceleration, then if you keep losing the accelerant, what would you expect? You would expect mass to increase, not decrease. Therefore, perfectly in line with the observation, as the sun keeps losing its photons and electrons, which is basically the same thing, its mass increases. And that's why the gravity engine continues to keep squashing and keep squashing. And ultimately, what will happen is it will collapse on itself. That's how much the mass will increase. There is no other way. Think about the machine. Why would it keep doing that? And why would it get so big that it will crush itself? Because as the number decreases, its mass keeps increasing and increasing, and the hunger for it increases until it completely squashes itself. And that's how a black star is formed when it goes supernova. The point is that it keeps losing the accelerant and the resistance to acceleration increases. So mass does not decrease, mass actually increases. It's not a lump of coal, it's a ratio. The one thing that needs definition and updating the definition is that acceleration, because I don't think they understand acceleration very well. Acceleration is not just the rate of change of speed. Acceleration should be defined as the injection of motion wave into a system. Heating is acceleration and changes mass. Think about a single molecule of ice, H2O. It'll be sitting on a table. It will have a mass and it sits on the table. Now think about the same molecule of ice, but now in a steam form. It's still H2O, but now it will actually lift up the molecule of ice, because if you put it in it rises. So its mass has changed. It has nothing to do with density. It's to do with energy content. So mass changes. Excuse me. Electrons are trapped photons. They are not unique things. If you look at physics, it will define an electron as one of the fundamental particles. But again, as you saw, there are no particles, and they don't repel one another, because that's nonsense as well. But now is another complete nonsense here, and that is that electrons are a very unique and very special particle in the making of the universe, if you like. And the idea being that not only do they behave like photons, but they have mass. So they're electromagnetism, but they have mass. Now look at this, by the way. If they were a unique event, that you needed them like bricks and mortar in order to form lattices, in order to form events, then look at what happens here. All you have to do is shine some light onto this electric thing, I think solar panel, and you can get an endless supply of electrons coming out of it without destroying the panel. How is that possible? Why would it be possible if they are unique things? How could it be possible that you can take indefinite amounts of electrons from the system without destroying the actual physical form of it? It should come apart. If you take away the bricks out of a house, if you believe that electrons are like a brick and mortar to make houses, then if you keep taking one, the other will collapse. It wouldn't exist. It will just be porous and evaporate. The idea that it can keep taking it out, again, is bodged up with the nonsense from Einstein's equation of E equals mc squared, that energy and mass are interchangeable. But by the way, look at this, and what happens now? So you take all of those electrons that are coming out, at the flick of a switch, you can turn them back into light. So it's it's like almost like a water cycle. You can take light, turn it into electrons, take electrons, turn it into light, and on and off it goes, at almost no effort at all. Now, if you're mad enough to believe that, in fact, Einstein is right and mass changes under fusion, think about fusion. It's extreme sets of conditions where mass can change and become energy. Then what the hell is going on here? How can you just keep changing things at a flick of a switch with no effort at all? Well, the answer is electrons actually are photons. They are just trapped photons, or photons that are of a certain frequency that find themselves in the vicinity of other events that have exactly the same frequency, and that's when things get interesting. So they have induced mass, they don't have real mass. And what does that mean? So frequency induced mass. If you look at photons, one of the things that becomes very clear in the laws of electromagnetism is that frequencies matter. Things that have similar frequencies can kind of interact with one another. They increase in intensity, and they do all kinds of things. But things that are vastly different frequencies don't do anything. They just completely separate. That's why radio waves can go through mountains, and you get signals in your house that go through walls, because the frequency of the radio wave doesn't interact with the molecules in your wall or in glass and so on. So that is an important thing. But look at what an electron is. A magnetic field is made up of electrons. All of the atoms in the air in our atmosphere have electrons in their orbits. So if you push an electron through the system, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to interact with all of the other electrons. So basically, the visual example I can give you of what's happening is, think about a photon or an electron as a white horse running all by itself. When an electron is on its own, because they do not exist, by the way, in vacuum. They apparently, according to physicists, they annihilate and all kinds of nonsense. But no, the reason they don't is because that interference here, the frequency interference stops and it just behaves like itself. If you look at superconductors, there are thousands of instances in which an electron just behaves like a photon, but they're ignoring all of that because remember, the bodge up has begun a long time ago and they need to keep bodging it up. So when an electron is on its own, it behaves like a photon in every way. But when it's in a magnetic field or in the atmosphere with other electrons, it's like running through water. So there is the way you can add mass in two ways to the source. You can either sit on the host 100 kilos and that will give it mass, or you can induce a mass by making it run through water. So now it doesn't run as fast as it did before because you have trapped it in this treacle mess that is induced by the frequency interference. So those are basically the main key events of the 9 videos that I said in this section, and hopefully, you know, if this did said something to you, you might want to have a look at those and see what I mean in a bit more detail. But my point is this, and this is what really bothers me because it's madness, is that if a plumber or a professional physicist, then we would have this scenario. He would go somewhere and the lady would say, oh, by the way, my tap is leaking water, Mr. Plumber. And the Mr. Plumber would say, what is water? Because he doesn't even know the basics of his profession. Like I just showed you, if you don't even know that the charge theory is wrong, if you don't even know that electrons are in fact photons, if you don't even know that protons don't repel, you know, all of the stuff that I've given you, and you don't even know what gravity is, but then we should really stop talking about nonsense, about magic and mystery, about different universes, millions of them all over the place, you know, things that can sense what we're thinking. But I can tell you about what all of this liquid comes from nothing. You know, all the nonsense that they go on from the singularity and the Big Bang nonsense through infinite universes, and it knows you're thirsty. So basically, why would you speculate when you don't even know what water is? So anyway, have a nice day.